Okay, I think I'm live. Sorry, I noticed that there's a bit of a delay between when I hit start and when it tells me that it's actually going live. So um, if I have been cut off, then it means that it's already started recording and I didn't realize. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me again on day 2 of Lend Me Your Ears, where I get to share with you some very helpful tips. Hopefully they're helpful tips on things that I notice often cause projects to derail or just not get the exact outcome that they had anticipated. So just not that wow factor. Yes, we delivered the project. Yes, that we provided some value, but was it smooth sailing? No. Did we have to wait more than we wanted to? Absolutely. Those are some of the common issues that I find projects encounter. And that's what these tips are really based on. So yesterday, I spoke about the why, so really being clear on understanding why our stakeholders wanted to start this project, and really that helps to then understand and solve that problem of, have we strategically set this project up in the right place? Do we have the right knowledge involved? Do we have the right people involved? And the right resources, for example, and are we scaling it in the right size? So perhaps maybe an approach might be that we start off with a smaller approach to then create a platform to get the larger vision as well. So, and also helping to set the right expectations of the project team as well as of our stakeholders. So that was yesterday. Today, we'll talk about understanding the strategy. So often when a project team is involved, the strategy has already been decided. So I probably already hear you saying to me, well, we don't really get involved in that. That's kind of what they do at the sales side, or what our leadership team does, but it's outside of our control. And whilst that's true, it doesn't mean that you don't get to ask some of those questions again. The worst thing that can happen is they just give you an answer, or it's already been discussed. So we've thought about it, we know what the answer to that question is, and we can get on with the project itself. Best case scenario is that people haven't spoken about it and there are these real gaps. And this is your first opportunity to notice if you're not as aligned as you had anticipated, or some of those problems that we often see during the delivery. For example, this is not necessarily the right person to go to, we should be going to somebody else, or maybe there were other considerations to this project that we hadn't factored in, which makes it more complex, which makes it, we need a larger solution, we need a different solution, we need a different team, we have to deliver it in a different way or form. So these are the tips that I'll give you today to then make sure that we bring these things to light, and then we can start. If we don't know, then we can't solve the problems. It's really about bringing out all of these things and any questions or any gaps, so that we can start off asking the questions, teasing out the gaps, speaking to our stakeholders, and maybe cementing a solution or an answer, or at least giving people something to think about for an answer, because a lot of these things are things which will trip us up on the project. They will add extra time, they will add extra money, or at least they'll cause us to possibly absorb some of the work and not budget them, or not charge for them. So we want to prevent all those situations from happening. We want to make sure that our project team has all of the information that they need to then design the right solution that's not only appropriate for the immediate stakeholders, but for the company as a whole. So, so in terms of the strategy, I typically, in all of my training programs, I look at 5 elements to the strategy. And the reason I do this is really, it does actually help you to consider pretty much all aspects of the strategy. So we're looking at, so if I run through what they are your information, your people, your technical aspects, processes, and your timing. So if we then go through and dissect all of those aspects, we've pretty much covered absolutely every element of a project. We've thought about, all the information that we need. We've thought about the people. There really doesn't leave anything much to chance. And so whilst there may still be other little things that pop their head throughout the project, they are going to be minimal, because we've pretty much covered most of them, or at least we start to then get our stakeholders involved in thinking about it, other considerations, when we start asking these questions. So I'll run through them with you. So if we start with information, actually, before I do that, what we really want to, there are 3 main aspects to each of these elements that we want to be questioning. So the first is, what is the current scenario? So if we're talking about people, if we're talking about information, if we're talking about processes and timing, what is the current situation and how does that work at the moment and play itself out versus how do we anticipate the project will change the aspect of, of that particular element. The next is, what impacts do we expect our project will have on this particular element? And then how do we plan to resolve that, or who do we need to work with to then resolve that? Because not everything will fall within the realms of the project team. However, it is up to us to then think about who the right person is to transfer that information onto so that we can resolve it. Because fundamentally, when we are the project team, even if it's not our responsibility to fix that issue, we will always be the ones who are blamed because we are the first point of change. So everybody notices that the delivery team have come in, everything was working before, something has changed, it's not working, it's obviously the fault of the project team. So we want to make sure that we don't have that reputation, and the best way to do that is to understand what are those likely impacts going to be, and then we can transition that information to the right person. We need to find out who that is. And the last thing is what support can we offer or can we point people to then enable this project to have the most positive outcome? Because essentially whatever project we roll out, for us to measure our success, we need to make sure that not only are people engaged in the project, but they're actually adopting the project itself. So whatever it is, they are adopting it. They're not looking for an alternative option, or they're not using it in a, then it's not causing, it doesn't have a bad reputation. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So those are the 3 questions that you essentially want to run through for each element that we cover. So the first element will be information. So some of the questions that I would be asking, and I teach people to ask, would be, firstly, do the stakeholders of the project anticipate this project to be a short-term solution to whatever pain point they are experiencing? Because typically a project is to resolve a pain point, or at least mitigate a potential pain point. So are they expecting this project to resolve a short-term pain point, or is it a long-term strategic solution to something, or perhaps to achieve a bigger vision? And the reason that's important to know is because if the vision is short-term, then there will obviously be a long-term aspect to resolving this thing as well. We want to make sure that whatever we construct, whatever project we put together, whatever the solution looks like, ideally can then fit into that long-term vision, because unless it can't, and I guess that's what we want to tease out here. So the scenarios will be, if it's a long-term vision, can we develop this project so that it is compatible with whatever the long-term vision is? And if it's not, then do we understand why it's not? Do we understand how we mitigate that from being, from having a different outcome? And who do we need to inform that this is not going to be compatible with a long-term solution? And then alternatively, if it is going to be a strategic solution, who are the people who need to be involved? What information do we need to know? And then how do we construct this project accordingly so that because typically for a strategic solution, there will be various milestones. There will probably be various interactions. So we want to consider that as a strategy as well. Do we do this as a staggered approach? A staged approach is another way of referring to it. Do we have to involve a certain team at every given time? So perhaps we deliver to one team and then we move on to a different team, and so on and so forth. So, and again, when we look at it that way, you can kind of see a short-term project purely by its name and nature, you will have a shorter timeline as well to deliver things. And that might just mean that you need to get things done faster. You might need to have a very skilled, heavily skilled team, and you don't have the luxury of recruiting people later down the track. You need to have everybody ready to go at the very beginning, because it's going to be a shorter, sharper sort of delivery process versus a long term, which might mean you bring different people on at different times of the project. So you don't need to have your entire full project team at the very beginning, but maybe you might have some consultation with various members so that you are thinking of the right things when you're developing that strategy. So that's one thing. The next piece of information that you want to be considering is definitions. And often projects don't consider this, but definitions are really critical, because, for example, when I look at my cost of goods sold, Now, you can have a look at what an accounting terminology is, but I know that in different organizations, different people have different definitions as to what they mean, that means for them specifically. So you really want to make sure, and sometimes I've noticed on projects that I've delivered, there may be 3 different teams who use the same word, but they have different meanings for each of them. So you want to be clear about what they mean when they talk about a particular thing. So you ask those sorts of questions. Sometimes they have a glossary, and if they do, you absolutely want to refer to that, but you always want to check that off. So that's part of the information gathering. And also when you're developing a solution, you want to be clear that what you're going to put as the output will actually marry back to what the requirement was at the very beginning. So that's the definitions component. The other component is, so what are the core needs of the project? And when I'm thinking about this, I'm kind of thinking about a very high level milestone. So for example, if I'm rolling out, let's say, an accounting package, I may need to understand what happens at the moment. So there might be a requirements gathering process, and that may take up to 2 weeks, depending on people's availability. And then the next part might be, working out or actually rolling out a pre-configured solution, but maybe just on a development site, for example. So that might be the next milestone. So you need to be able to strategically have a development site, for example, where people can develop separately to a live production site. And then you may need to do testing, maybe in a different testing environment, for example. And then you want people where you actually have stakeholders testing things. And then there might be a switch over. So there might be like a parallel run where you have the new thing going with the old thing at the same time. And is that even possible? And then you need to think about the decommissioning process. So when you switch off the old and then go with the new, does that mean that people still have access to the old as well as the new? How will you make sure that everybody's just using the new? These are some of the things that you want to start teasing out, because then you need to think, I guess just running through that scenario tells me already, I know that I need to have a dedicated development environment. Does the project team provide that, or does the organisation or the stakeholders actually have that environment available? I may need to have a test environment. Do we use the same development environment for that, which I would typically say we don't want to do that? Or does, and again, is that something that the project team will provide, or is that the sort of thing that the stakeholders will provide? So you need to make sure you understand, you're clear about it, and we all are able to provide it, because maybe the project team doesn't have that functionality, and nor does the stakeholders. So then how do you approach that situation? And then the last is with the decommissioning, do people need to be trained? Do people need to be available? When you switch something off, is that going to happen at a particular time of the day where it's not peak time of the day, for example? And then we'll talk about that a little bit further down. But this is a consideration, and who needs to be involved in that process? Do we need to upskill somebody to make sure if there are any questions that come up, somebody's able to ask them? Who do they go to ask those sorts of questions? Is it even possible to switch to have 2 things running in parallel? Or maybe that is important to them, and maybe that needs to run in parallel for some financial systems, for example, or reporting changes. You need to have that parallel run available for 30 days, because there are different things that happen at different times of the month. And so you want to be able to have a true test of each of those scenarios. You want to be able to compare the 2. So that's just another consideration. And then I'm getting lots of calls and I'm just wondering why. So anyway, sorry about that, guys. And then the last under the information element would be, what information will stakeholders need to engage, adopt and adapt to the change? So firstly, you want to make sure that it might be, how does the process work, or how do you do your work every day? So I understand, do you go to a particular area to get some information somewhere? Do I then need to make my changes available in this location for you, or do we find a new place for that? Is it even compatible to the change I'm going to deliver for you? As an example, do you need to have some sort of training to be able to adopt the change if we're looking at adoption? Is this going to challenge my work, the work that I do? And that is a huge thing that comes up, and that's a huge change element piece that I do talk about, in my training programs or when I'm going through coaching. But when you start to ask those questions, you can understand and you start to see some resistance, and where the resistance might lie, because potentially when we're challenging people's work, or at least the way that they see it might feel like it's being challenged. We want to approach that. We want to understand why and how can we change, how can we make this a much more adaptable situation for them. And we turn this into a positive. So this is not replacing your job. This is actually going to make your job a lot easier, but here is how you add value. So maybe changing the dialogue. So this is really quite critical. The next element will be people. So when we're talking about people, we want to know, so firstly, who is the overall decision maker? Often this is missed. And so because a stakeholder brings us on, and it might be, let's say, a CIO or a general manager or a production manager or something of that nature, a leadership position, has brought us on. Yet they are not going to be the person who makes the fundamental decision. It might actually be a whole different team because they are the ones who are going to interact with this change all the time. So we want that to be clear. We want to know who's going to decide and sign this off when I want to deliver the project and I want to end it. That's the first thing. And sometimes there is more than one person. So the best way that I describe this is who has the power to veto this project. So who has the power to stop it if they need to? And that's the person I want to make sure that I engage into the project, either directly or indirectly, but I want to have some form of access to them, because if they have the ability to stop my project, I need to make sure I'm feeding them the right information so that they don't want to ever stop my project and only see the value in my project. So that's quite critical. The next is, who do I need to engage in my project? So it would definitely be the people who are going to own this change at some point, but it might be other teams as well who help to provide a much fuller solution, a much better solution, or a solution that's going to help more than just the one team on the project. It might actually satisfy a greater audience. Sometimes it might be people outside of an organization, like an external vendor who has some part to play. Sometimes it's a customer, but I guess I need to start asking those sorts of questions. And we will look at that a bit further down when we're looking at the requirements, but it's good to start asking those questions now, because I need to then think about, how do I start engaging with those people? Do I even have direct access to them? Do I need to let them know that I'm going to start speaking to them? And do I need to let their leadership team know that I need to start interacting with their people? Because sometimes some leadership teams are actually quite sensitive about that sort of stuff. They don't want you to go directly to the team. They want you to address them first. Do I know that sort of information? So that's what you want to start finding out. And then who is accountable for the project? So that's the success. So it might have been, there might be a different decision maker on one aspect of delivery of the project, and then there might be a different decision maker for the budget, for example, of the project, versus another decision maker again when it comes to the signing off. So maybe the person who adopts the change has to have a level of sign off, and then the next level will be the person who brought us in, perhaps they sign off, and then the last person might be the person who actually releases the budget. So those situations do occur, but I want to be clear, there is no right or wrong answer here. It's just a matter of asking the question, finding out the answers. And then the last is, who will be impacted? Again, and that flows on with what I was saying at the very beginning. Who will be impacted by this change? How will they be impacted by the change? And then how can I help to mitigate the impacts to the change? So do I need to provide them with some form of training? Do I need to provide them with some form of documentation? Is there some sort of a handover? Is there a support team that they need to go to? Is there a new person that they need to put in place so that they have a go-to person? All those sorts of things are relevant, but it depends on your audience as well. So that's what you want to start finding out. Okay, technical. So technical will really depend on the kind of project that you're delivering, but it's essentially the technical tools that you need. So again, if we ask what internal things, so the very beginning is actually thinking about our own project team. So start with the beginning. For me to actually run this project, what are the technical needs that I have? So that might be, I need to have access to a particular drive or location. I need to have access to an actual building. So I need to have a building pass, or maybe I need to go through an induction process. There are plenty of organizations that you have to go through an induction process before you can actually work on their site. Perhaps I need to have a laptop or a computer that's accessible to them. Perhaps I need to be able to have a remoting ability so I can remote into their system. all those sorts of things are relevant. So those are some of the technical things. So it could be hardware, it could be software, it could be security accesses, it could be gate accesses, it could be parking access, any of those sorts of things I've lumped under technical, but it sort of helps you to start thinking about, you know, the sorts of things. And it could also be tools or equipment. So, you know, if your project, and normally I work on business projects, but I've also worked on construction projects. So sometimes it might be hiring the right equipment. And in fact, speaking of hiring, if you're running training, you might need to hire training facilities, for example. So that's another consideration, and you might have all of the things to go with it. So presentations, you know, how are you going to do your PowerPoint presentations? Do you have a data projector? And those sorts of examples are the technical things. So that's from an internal side. And if we're thinking about it from an external, again, what will your stakeholders need to be able to adopt this change and to be able to make it successful? So do they have to have training on, you know, technical training? Do they need to have some sort of a wiki, like a go-to site on, you know, their page or something like that, so that they have an instruction manual of what to do once they do get this change imparted on them? So what are the impacts to the technical, and also what are the impacts to the technical systems and activities? And then what are the mitigations to the systems, technical tools, equipment, any of that sort of stuff that our stakeholders will either need. So perhaps they don't have this now and they will need to have it. There might be an upgrade. They might need to have an upgrade to their systems. Sometimes when we roll something out onto somebody's system, they might have a lot of their own personal folders. Have we considered that sort of stuff? Where will that? So, for example, if we do like an upgrade of their actual desktop, for example, sometimes it overrides some of the things that have been sitting on somebody's personal drive. Have we factored that in? Where will that go? Because that might still be critical to the organisation. Perhaps that individual could not have been saving it there, but that's not to say that they haven't. And if they do, this may have a critical impact on the organisation. Have we considered what we do in that aspect? Have we even asked those questions? Maybe there's a check-off form before we even roll out a project or roll out a change. We'll notify the impacted stakeholders, and there's a, I don't know, a survey or a physical checklist that they need to tick off to say, I don't have things here, or I've moved things here to some other location, for example. So those are some of the technical things. And then that kind of feeds into the processes. So I would ask the same sorts of questions. How do processes work at the moment before the project change? How will processes work post the project change? How are we going to impact that change? And then how are we going to mitigate any of the impact that we roll out across the processes? This is a really good time to start also thinking about, often with a project, some of the things that, because by nature, we're looking at more than just one element that we're going to deliver. So we start asking people questions on their day-to-day work. We start looking at how they structure their organisation. So we start to see patterns of broken processes. Perhaps there isn't an owner for something, you know, perhaps there isn't a location for something, perhaps their security is not necessarily the way that it should be. And maybe none of these elements have anything to do with our project. But as a really nice value add, what I do is I actually record a lot of that information in a register. And you can call it whatever you want. It might be, you know, opportunities to improve register or whatever it is, but at least it's something, and it's not necessarily your job to go and resolve it. But if you, by way of doing the project, identify them and potentially identify an owner, or at least somebody who you've notified about this, this is a really nice piece of information that you can hand back to the client, because this is an opportunity for them to further improve their organisation, whether they choose to do anything about it or not, but at least they have insight. Because sometimes it's a case of not knowing. So you don't know what you don't know. And if somebody's able to provide you that information, then you might structure things differently and change and improve your organisation and your people again further. And then the last aspect is timing. And this is definitely a time where people actually, where I find a lot of projects get stuck, become delayed, you know, in terms of what they've set out to achieve. And this can cut into your budget, this can cut into your scope. And the reason for it is because some very simple questions haven't been asked. For example, does our project run over any holidays? So if there is a holiday period, you have to think about the public holiday, but you might also need to consider if it's around a time of a weekend, people are often taking 4 days off, you know, or 5 days off even. These are the sorts of things you want to start asking people. You ask your internal team first. Are there any project leave that is anticipated? And then how will I overcome that? You know, so maybe we need to extend out the project timeline, or maybe we change the strategy and we change when we deliver what piece of the project to fit, you know, to make sure that we are then factoring in any leave for our own project, also for our stakeholders. Also, if there is a time that a stakeholder is critical and they're going to take that time off, is there somebody else who can shadow them for a period of time so that we can still use a shadow, you know, alternative to continue the project going? Or is that person's information way too critical and there's nothing else that we can achieve? So, so that's another thing. There's the other element is there an ideal time to deliver the project versus a required time? And the reason I ask that is sometimes ideally you want to be delivering it around Christmas time, but maybe because of a legislative change, for example, you need to deliver it in November. And in that scenario, it might help you to change the way in which you strategize the project by, for example, the piece that you have to deliver in November, you do that piece first. And then you do the rest of the project in December, or roll out the rest of the project in December when it makes more sense to do that. Maybe you don't have the ability, but asking the question helps us to start thinking about alternative ways of delivering the same project, and maybe to increase the impact, to increase the opportunities, to increase the value that you provide to your clients. And also going back to people's availability, we really want to start considering things like, maybe they're really busy, like it might be a financial year end, for example, you know, and so maybe you just don't have access to those people at that time. So at the very beginning of the project, I ask people, so in terms of your week or your month, or, you know, we're here for the next 3 months, are there any critical times that you're just blocked out, you're unavailable? And if I know that up front, I can then structure my project plan to suit that scenario, because if you don't know it, it's hard to plan for it. But if you do know it, at least you know how to structure the project, or you can just let people know that, look, we're not going to be able to deliver this project in 5 months. It will actually have to be delivered in 8 months because of these scenarios. So knowing them up front means that you can manage that situation better. And the last thing I want to say about all of that, and something else that's critical, is when you are delivering a project, you want to make it very clear to your stakeholders, if they have committed to these dates, you want them to understand what the impacts of not meeting those dates are. And then you follow through on whatever those impacts are. So all too often people say to me, look, I want to roll out, I've already told my stakeholders, these are the things that we need to adhere to because these are the impacts. But then when it comes to the date and people are not getting back to you and they're not doing what they said that they've committed to doing, people just wait around. Project teams just wait around and they absorb that time. They absorb that time until it's just too late. And then they are the ones who are scrambling to try and get it done at the last minute. When in fact, we don't need to do that. If people understand, look, if we can't deliver we've strategized these dates because firstly, as an organization who would deliver projects, we have other things in the pipeline that we need to adhere to. So if we can't get your time, then we're not going to be able to deliver this project by that date. And then we'll have to stop, go to our clients, and then come back in 2 or 3 months' time, because that's how far ahead we plan out our projects. That might be an impact. It might just be that a critical developer or a critical person on that project is not available at that time. It might be lots of other factors, but these are the sorts of things that you want to make sure, whatever it is, you communicate to your stakeholders in writing in multiple different ways so that they understand the true impacts, and then you stick to those impacts. It's a little bit like rearing children. Whatever you say you're going to do, you stick to the punishment. And it's just about setting that right foundation so people understand this is how I work. And as long as you stick to your word, people will do the same. So, but you need to give them that opportunity to understand how it's impacting you to deliver the outcome that you needed to deliver and that you've committed to deliver to them. So it means giving them time up front so that they know what's coming. It means give them enough notice that you're going to need their time for testing. It means meeting with them regularly so they understand how the plan works, sharing the plan with them, sharing the challenges with them so that they understand why you're not going to give them what they need to at the end of the day. So I've definitely gone over, and I also have a meeting to get to, but I really appreciate your company. Thank you so much. I hope you've had some value from what I've discussed today. Kareen from Projecting with People, if you want any more information, feel free to email me at info@projecting.com.au. I'm always available to answer your project information or questions. So thanks for watching, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.